right, well, this week we're kicking off a brand new series called Not For Me. Not For Me. We're talking about why people don't like church. Now, this is one of those series that I'm really excited about. I get excited about most of them, but I'm especially excited about this. We've been talking about this for a while, and it is so central to who we are as a church. Now, if you're new here this week, like maybe you came on Easter and you're like, all right, I'll give it a shot. We'll see what next Sunday's like. This for you, or if you're new to church in general, right? This for you might seem a little bit like you're sitting in on a family chat, right? And so there will be parts that aren't specifically addressed to you. And, at that point you can, check your inbox or something, or you can lean in, and I think it might help you understand why we are the way we are, and also kind of paint a clearer picture of the church. But if you're someone who's been here for a while, it is super important I think, for you to know what we're talking about in this series, because it is part of our DNA. And if you know why we are the way we are, well, then this is a good chance for us to go a little deeper into that. And so our series is called Not For Me. Now, so here's how we'll start off, okay? Have you ever invited somebody to do something and they turned you down because it wasn't for them? Like, it's not their thing, Like just a regular thing. I'm not talking about church. So I like basketball, right? It's kind of like, it's how I like to spend my free time. And every once in a while, I'll bump into someone, we'll start talking, and I'll say, oh, you should play with us, we're playing at this time, at this place, come on down, it'll be fine. And a lot of times, if they're not, basketball people, right, they're like, oh, no, thanks for the invite, but no, it's not really for me, dang, whatever, fine. I'm like, okay, whatever. But the conversation ends, and it's like a net positive, They're like, oh, that's cool, we could have hung out, maybe we'll do something else another time, but our relationship is kind of taking a step forward, right? Or maybe if you ask me to come over your house and bake brownies, It's just not my thing. I love spend time with you, but we don't have to make a mess and just get some cosmic brownies and play a game. I don't know. So I'll probably just be like, oh, thanks, I appreciate that, but no, I'm not doing that. But overall, I would feel good about our relationship. Like, oh, he wants to spend time with me. We took a step in the right direction. And that's often how it works when one person kind of extends themselves to someone else. In most situations. If your experience is like my experience, what I have found is that this principle does not apply in the same way when it comes to church. If you have a friend and you're like, hey, you should come to church with me. It's not like, oh, hey, nah, it's like, and like, they're like in the corner and you can see that looking for explanations. I got the thing with my dog on Sundays, and it can, not always, maybe this hasn't happened for you, but it often gets uncomfortable. In fact, maybe you're here today because you ran out of explanations. And it's like, all right, well, they've asked me 47,000 times, so maybe if I just go this one time, they'll stop and we won't have to keep having this conversation. If you're there, I get that. I've been there. But the question we're asking over the next couple of weeks is really behind every not for me, what's the reason? Like the why? The why behind the not for me. And if you're somebody who considers themselves a follower of Jesus, the question, before we go into the details, the question really is, should we care? Is there something we can do about this? Is it our responsibility Or does it just come with the territory? Is that just the way it is? It's just not for them. And so it's for us, but it's not for them. I think if we ask some hard questions and dig in to what the church was originally and what followers of Jesus who came after him, what they had to say about this, I think it will shed a lot of light on this whole issue, whether you consider yourself a believer, a follower of Jesus or not. But for it to really make sense, we kind of have to zoom out and step back a little bit and look at the big picture, a little bit like we did last week if you were here for Easter Sunday. Like this whole thing, almost 2,000 years ago, Jesus shows up, right? He's from really a normal, like no-name town called Nazareth. He's really not a very well-known person at first when he's growing up. He's got some pretty normal parents. There was like a little scandal with his mom very early on in life, but since then things have been pretty normal. They've been moved around. He starts to teach people about what God is like, and he's magnetic. He's magnetic, which is not the way a lot of people picture Jesus. But everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. He connected with people who had no interest in God or religion. He connected with people who did. People leaned in to the things that Jesus had to say. He was so attractive, he was so magnetic, his teaching was, that it was hard for him to actually get around. He told people that God, like in a culture where people saw God as the cosmic lawgiver, the hammer dropper, he explained how like God is a father who knows the number of hairs on your head. Like you know the cowlicks on the hairs, on the heads of your children. He knows you deeply, intimately, and cares about you more than you care about your own kids, if you have kids. And he paints this picture like he is the expression of this invisible God. And people want more of it. They want to hear what he has to say. He talks about how God, being a father, knows that there's going to be stuff in your life that you can worry about, but that you don't have to. That he has your life in his hands. That there will be uncertainty, but you don't have to live in fear. That the one who made it all cares about you. So people continue to come to him. And then he starts making some pretty radical claims about who he is. He talks about that deep longing like within you, the search for something more, the whole idea of I still haven't found what I'm looking for. He's like, I'm what you're looking for, which is bold. If you call that deep desire for something greater, if you call that hunger, I'm that bread to that hunger. If you call it water, thirst, I'm the water to that thirst. Darkness, I'm the light to that darkness. If it's weariness, I'm the rest to your weary soul. I am the answer you're looking for. And people, some don't know what to do with this. Some feel threatened by who he is, who he says he is. But this is magnetic. And all the while, he has these people that are following him. He's inviting them, come follow me. Like, come and be my disciple, which is a fancy word for student, learner. Just be with me. Learn my way of life. Learn my teaching. Come to me. And people would. He developed this little following of people who were very close to him and wanted to be just like him. And there comes a point in the story where he's wrapping it up. He knows he's going to leave. He sits him down for a meal. A holiday meal is a Passover. We call it the Last Supper. He sits him down and he tells him he's going to leave. He says it in plain language. But he leaves them with something. He says, all right, a new command I give you, like new marching orders, that you love one another. And they had heard that before, but he's not saying love your neighbor as yourself. He's saying love as I have loved you. And to them, that would have hit home because they were all different types of people from all different ways of life. Some were like good guys, some were not so good guys. Some were for the government, some were anti-government. Some were like okay with the religious crowd, others were totally pushed out of it. And he's like, you know how I reached out to you? You know how you had a place in my crew? Remember how I washed your feet? Remember everything I've done for you? He's like, love people in that way. And he says this, which is just, this could be like a thing to think about for hours all on its own. He says, and everyone will know you are my followers by the way you love one another. That will be the thing. That was what it was supposed to be. Everyone will know you're my disciple by the way you love one another. So then he dies, and they're like, well, now what? They go into hiding. We talked about this last week. And then he comes back, and this validated everything that he said. But he kind of huddles them up again. And he gives them what we call a commission. Like, remember that whole thing about disciples, like what it looks like to be my disciple? You love one another like I loved you. Remember that? Remember that's what I said? Now, I want you to go and invite people into that. Go make disciples who love like I have loved you. He gives them this commission. And you know what's nuts? They did it. They did it. And they actually were known for the way that they loved one another. People who were not religious people who were not from that area, they were drawn to this movement of followers of Jesus. It was magnetic, just like he was. There's this one theologian who says they loved each other with such a radical kind of love. They weren't fake. They didn't pretend. They took their masks off. They were vulnerable with one another. They were real about their doubts, their issues, their brokenness. They laughed, they cried, they sang, they shared their lives with one another. They were generous. People who were nothing like one another loved one another. And it grew by the day because people from the outside wanted in. This guy says that they gave people a vision of life that was so bold and dynamic, it was breathtaking. And that was like church. That was what the church was supposed to be. It was amazing. It was amazing. Now, I think it's fair to say we've kind of strayed a little bit from that. But even then, there were people, when they heard this whole thing about Jesus, even then there were people that were like, not for me. It's not for me. Jesus said it would be that way. And it always will be that way. There will always be, not for me. But do you know what their reason was behind the not for me? You know why people wouldn't join this movement? The reason, over and over and over again, the reason that Jesus gave them and told them, here's why people will not be okay with you. The reason was Jesus. He said, I will be a stumbling block for people. Peter said, he is the stumbling block. He is the thing that gets in the way. Who Jesus is, who he said he was, and what he said he would do was the thing that got in the way. There were people that were like, yeah, that community of people that love one another and care about that like rapidly growing movement, there's something about it, but I just can't get over the fact that this guy is who he said he was and that he rose from the dead. I can't do that. And so I'm sorry, it's not for me. They couldn't say Jesus was Lord. They would say Caesar was Lord, Nero was Lord. They couldn't do it. This guy, there's no way he rose from the dead. That was the reason behind the why. And Jesus said that would happen. Some people won't believe. They just won't be able to wrap their mind around that. And so you'll get a not for me. So here's the question. The last time you heard, not for me, was Jesus the reason? I don't know what your experience has been like. But I rarely hear people say, I just can't get over the fact. Everything else is great. I love that whole idea of sharing your life, loving one another, all that, but I can't get over the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. You know, there's one day a year, there's one Sunday a year where all we talk about is Jesus rising from the dead. And it's the highest attended Sunday of the entire year. That often is not the thing that gets in the way. Do you know what I do here? Do you know what? I'm willing to bet you here. And if you're a not for me, the last time you said not for me, you know what I'm willing to bet might be a reason why? They're judgmental. Ever heard of that? They're fake. They're self-righteous, hypocritical, and they want your money. Not for me. Jesus said there would be times where people can't wrap their mind around who he is. That is gonna happen. That is gonna happen. But I think the issue is kind of swung. I think our problem here is not that Jesus is the reason why, there is nothing we can do about that. And if it is for you, you can still come and see. You can still belong here before you believe. You can still wrestle with your questions. But if that's the thing, I understand. He said that would be the thing for some people. The problem has shifted from Jesus being the reason why, mainly to the dominating reason being church. Church is the reason why. And if you read about what the original church was like, the original followers of Jesus, this is hard to find. You continue all along the way to see people who just can't wrap their minds around the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. You rarely hear, I just can't stand those people. And so my question for you, and this is a hard question, it's one of those face the brutal facts questions, ask the hard question questions. If you're someone who follows Jesus, what we need to ask is, behind every not for me, is he the reason? Or are we? Is this something the church needs to figure out? I would argue that it is. That it is. And over the next couple weeks, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go into some of those things. The idea of the church being judgmental. That's the reason why you don't wanna be in the church. That's the thing you don't like about the church. I get that. If the church is fake, people in the church are fake, and that's the thing you don't like about church. Money hungry, that's the thing. Self-righteous, that's the thing. Hypocritical, that's the thing. What I would suggest to you is that the things that you don't like about church are the things that Jesus doesn't like about church. And I think if you're a follower of Jesus, we need to own that. Ask the hard questions and see what needs to be done to fix that. What's interesting is that before we go into any of those, which we'll do in the next couple weeks, the question we have to ask is how far do we need to be willing to go to fix that? Right? Like, what do we need to do to clear the way for people to see what Jesus is actually like? To get to the point where people are not leaving the church because of the church, but they're leaving the church because of Jesus. What do we need to do? This was actually an issue pretty early on in the life of the church. And we have it written down. The Apostle Paul, who came after Jesus, wrote a letter to a church that was struggling with something like this. It was starting to become an issue. It was in a city called Corinth. And they had a question. They wanted to know if they could eat food sacrificed to idols. And I don't know, like meat sacrificed to idols. Now, for you, probably you didn't like wake up this morning wondering if you could do that. But they did, because it was a thing. They lived in a culture that worshiped idols, and there was a lot of meat. And they're like, can we eat this meat? Now that we're into Jesus and we believe in him, can we eat this? Is it all right? And Paul writes them, he's like, oh, eating the meat, it's fine. It has no spiritual significance. It's simply a choice whether to do it or not. And you're free to exercise your freedom. You're right. You want to eat it, eat it. You don't want to eat it, fine. However, and you should read this. This is in chapter 8 and 9 of a letter we call 1 Corinthians. It's jam-packed. I can't go into the whole thing. But he says, be careful that your free choice, that the exercising of your rights, that you're doing whatever you want to do, yes, no, doesn't matter, no spiritual significance. Be careful that your non-spiritual choices don't destroy the faith of someone who's not quite there yet. He says, like, those are people that Jesus loved enough to give everything for. And so he says, and we don't know exactly the context, exactly how this was bothering people who were wondering about the food sacrificed to idols, but apparently it was getting in the way of people's faith. And he says, if it's gonna stop, if it's going to destroy the faith of someone that Jesus loved enough to give everything for, he goes, I'll never eat meat again. It's not worth the roast beef sandwich when we're talking about someone actually coming to know who Jesus is. And then he goes on, and to back it up, he explains his approach. He kind of like lets them behind the curtain. He's like, look, you know I go around from church to church to church to church, right? And I'm trying to make it. I got needs. I have to survive. And you know what? If you think about it, it's totally fair for me to ask for money from you to support this thing. But he goes, but I never did, because I wanted nothing to hinder this message. I wanted to make sure if somebody was walking away, they were walking away because they were wrestling with who Jesus is, not because they thought I just was after their money. And he breaks it down and kind of lays out his philosophy, and this I'll show you. He says this, he says, though I'm a slave, though I'm free, there we go, though I'm free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to serve to everyone. I've put their needs, their desires above my own. And then he breaks this down. He says, to win as many as possible. And this is kind of a funny word, win, but he's kind of leading up to a metaphor here. He says, so what that means is to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. He's not saying I put on a mask. He's not saying I pretended to be someone I'm not. He's saying I did what I needed to understand where they are and where they're coming from, to win them. He says, to those under the law, I became like one under the law, thinking like them, understanding them. He says, though I myself am not under the law. Why? So as to win those under the law, to get through to them, to make this message clear. He says, to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law. Another little qualifier here, he says, though I'm not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law. He's talking about that idea of loving one another. He says, so as to win those not having the law. And in case you don't get it, he gives us another one. He says, to the weak, I became weak. To those whose faith is like not there yet. He's not insulting them. He's like, I learned what they were thinking, what they were like. I became weak. Why? To win the weak. And then he says this thing, it's a phrase that's become popular in our culture. He says, I have become all things to all people. Why? So that by all possible means, I might save some. Now, save here, you might have some emotions attached to that word, but he's talking about what happens when someone comes to understand who Jesus really is. I'm willing to put myself in their shoes, to think like them, to understand them. How do I have to package this product to get it through to them? Maybe product is not the right word, but what he's talking about is where there's non-essentials, how can I use those things to more clearly communicate just how good God is? How far is he willing to go? He would say, well, whatever it takes. He's willing to do whatever it takes. He then gets to this metaphor. He says, look, you know how in a race, you run the race to win? He says, make choices intentionally to win the prize. people are worth it. He says, run in such a way that you would win the prize. Make intentional choices because people are worth it. Do whatever it takes because people are worth it. And so if you want to know what Paul meant by what he said, look at what he did after he said it. And so I wanted to know, I'm a practical guy. I'm like, okay, in theory that works, but what does this actually look like? I'll give you an example. One of the first groups of people Paul went to were the Jewish people, all right? And he wanted to bring someone along named Timothy. Now, Timothy was a younger guy. His dad was Greek. Let me tell you something in case you don't know Jewish history. Back then, the ancient Jewish people, the sign of their faith was something called circumcision, which really only affects men in that context. And it was a really, really big deal for them, for the ancient Jewish people. And Paul knew, if I'm going to be able to get through to these people, and I have Timothy, whose dad is a Greek, and who has not been circumcised, it will totally discredit our message. It will be a distraction. It will get in the way. It will become the stumbling block. So you know what he has Timothy do? He circumcises him. He's a grown man in a culture with no anesthesia or precise surgical equipment. That's a really big deal. I bet Timothy was like, can we just pray for them? Seriously, though, in the context of the church, oh, well, they'll just put it in God's hands. We'll not do the hard thing, and we'll trust God. Paul would say, yes, trust God, but we do whatever it takes. And so this is why we say here that we are a church for people who don't go to church. This is why. We want to do whatever it takes to understand where people are coming from, to figure out what the stumbling blocks are, the barriers, and pull them away. Now, a little disclaimer here, all right? And a lot of people have asked, hold on a second. They're like, okay, church for people who don't go to church. So I go here. So, like, is this not for me? No, the idea here in the word church, you're here, you're in the church. And theologically, that includes everything a church should include, right? There's community, there's connection, there's belonging, there's development. All of that stuff is in the idea of church. But we are always focused outward for the people who are not yet here. William Tyndale, he was around hundreds of years ago. He was one of the first people to translate the Bible into English. And back then, it's a long story, but back then, this cost him his life because he wanted people to clearly understand the good news about Jesus. And you know what he said? He said, the church is the one institution that exists for those outside it. And so for us, the question is, well, what does that look like for us? When it comes to non-spiritual things that don't have anything to do with our faith, how can we tailor those decisions to people who are not typically comfortable in church? It's why we have such tight security downstairs in our kids' area. If you drop your kids off someplace, anywhere other than church, there's gonna be tight security, right? And we want that here. Now, if we were a bunch of people who all knew each other in a church that had been around for a long time, and I knew Aunt Joan was the one who's watching all the kids, I can just leave the kids and I'm not gonna worry about it because I trust her. And she's probably a great woman. But if someone comes in and does not know her, the whole time, if they're willing to bring their kids down there, the whole time they're gonna be sitting here wondering if they're safe. And so we will remove that barrier and put security down there. Do a check-in process where we want you to know we are checking your number with their number and you can't get past unless you have it. It's a big deal. Plus, it makes me feel good. My kids are down there. I want to know there's a security system. A lot of people have asked about the lighting in here. Why? Why is it dark in here? It's because, for me, when I didn't want to be in church, it was nice for me to be able to come in, to not really be seen, to hide, and then make a decision and decide, okay, are these people nuts or is this a community I want to be part of? It's a big deal. It's why we have carpet tiles in here, because we want people to bring in coffee, especially if you're at the 8:30 service. But really, during music, especially if you're not used to it, just having something in your hands is comfortable. And if we do that, it's gonna spill. So we wanna be able to pick up a carpet tile, throw it away, and put another one down. This is the thing that drives every one of our decisions. Do you know why? Because people matter. Because this is what the early church did. Because we wanna make sure if someone says this isn't for me, it's because they don't believe that Jesus is who he said he is, and they're tired of trying to wrestle through that. Not because there was something we did that we could have not done, and it could have changed everything. Paul says, run in such a way that you will win the prize. And he got this from Jesus. This is the whole story. This is what we believe, that Jesus became like one of us and did whatever he needed to win your heart. Because to him, you were a prize worth running for. To him, you were worth whatever it takes. So I'm going to ask the band to come up here, and we'll wrap up. But here's what I want to leave you with. If you're somebody who follows Jesus, there may be someone in your life that you're praying for, someone that you care about, someone that you want to understand what you have come to understand. You've seen how good it is and you just want them to get it. But it's not for them. There may be a day when they say, fine. There may be a day, maybe it'll be in a difficult season of life. Maybe it'll be after something really hard. Maybe something will happen, and maybe one Sunday they say, I'll give it one shot. One shot. We want to be ready for them. We want them to feel like we were expecting them. Because we believe that they are a prize that is worth running for. Because Jesus believes that we are a prize worth running for.